My husband was a 2-minute man. Then I found out what I'd been missing. Part 1. The White Sheet. Eleanor Marie Caldwell had never been a woman who did things by halves. At 18, she threw herself into love the way other girls her age threw themselves into college applications and summer internships, with reckless, unblinking commitment. She met Douglas Ray Whitmore at the regional distribution company where she took a temp job filing invoices for the summer. He was 27, tall in a way that made her feel genuinely small, with a voice that could soothe a room into silence. He had 2 ex-girlfriends in his rearview mirror and a 2-year gap in his romantic history that he wore like a scar, visible to those who looked closely, faded enough that most people didn't notice. Eleanor noticed. She noticed the way he held the office door open for her every single morning without fail. She noticed the way he asked her about her classes, her dreams, her father's opposition to her working here instead of focusing on her college prep. He remembered the name of her dog. He brought her soup when she came to work with a cold. What she did not notice, what she was far too young, too pure, too desperate for warmth to notice, was that Douglas had been to bed with other women before her. That he knew things. That his gentleness was not the awkward tenderness of a man discovering a woman for the first time, but the practiced patience of a man who had learned, through experience, exactly how much pressure a new lover could bear. They dated for 6 months. He waited. He never pushed, not really, or at least not in a way that felt like pushing. "I'm going to marry you someday, Ellie," he would say, stroking her hair. "I can wait. I just want you to know where this is going." And she believed in the way only an 18-year-old who has never been loved before can believe, completely, desperately, with her whole heart. She gave it to him on a Thursday night in October, in the small 1-bedroom apartment they had started sharing 2 months prior because her father had made it clear she could not date and live under his roof. The apartment had thin walls and a radiator that clanked like a dying engine, and the bed was a mattress on the floor with sheets they had bought at a discount store. It was not romantic. It was not what she had imagined. But she did it because she loved him, because she believed this was what love required, and because when he looked at her with those soft brown eyes and said, "I just need you, Ellie. I need you to know I would never hurt you," she could not bear to say no. The first time was brief. He entered, pushed once, twice, and then it was over. He rolled off her, breathing hard, and muttered something about not being sure he'd finished in the right place. He asked her to stay still for a moment, to which she complied, confused and vaguely uncomfortable. There was no blood, no dramatic rupture, no Hollywood moment of searing pain. Just a strange, anticlimactic shortness of breath and a feeling in her chest like she had swallowed a stone. A month later, her period did not come. Eleanor was not a fool. She knew what this meant. But knowing and accepting are 2 different animals. She was 18, living in a rented room with a man her father had forbidden, and now she was carrying his child. Her father, Harold Caldwell, a retired steelworker with the emotional vocabulary of a brick wall and the stubbornness of a Missouri mule, had told her that if she ever brought Douglas home, she could consider herself no daughter of his. He had used those exact words. "Consider yourself no daughter of mine." So when Eleanor found out she was pregnant, she did what any terrified 18-year-old with her father's temper and her own desperate love would do. She panicked. She called in sick to work, packed a single suitcase, left a note for her father that said only "I love you, I'm sorry, please don't hate me," and disappeared for 3 months. When she finally came home, her father met her at the kitchen table with the kind of stillness that was worse than shouting. He listened to her story in silence. When she finished, he said, "You can stay with him if you want. But you will not bring that child into this world without a plan. You will finish school. You will work. And if you choose to have that baby, you will do it right. Eleanor's mother, Patricia, who had died of pancreatic cancer when Eleanor was 12, had left a silence behind her that no one in the Caldwell family had ever learned how to fill. Her father had never remarried. He raised Eleanor alone, badly in some ways, brilliantly in others, with the kind of gruff, inarticulate love that shows up as hot meals on the table and a roof over your head rather than words. Eleanor understood, even then, that his opposition to Douglas was not about Douglas himself. It was about the fact that Douglas was 9 years older, had a past Eleanor could not access, and represented everything her father had fought against in building a stable life for his daughter after the tragedy that had gutted their family. But Eleanor was 18, pregnant, and so in love that she could not see straight. She did not terminate the pregnancy. She couldn't. Even at 18, with no money, no degree, and a man she'd known for less than 2 years, something in her refused. The first child, she told Douglas, if you lose it, it can hurt you. Physically and something else. I won't do it. So they kept the baby. They named him Ryan. They got married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse because Eleanor's belly was already showing and the dress she wanted wouldn't zip. Her father attended, stiff as a board, and did not give the newlywed couple his blessing but did not withhold his presence, which, in the Caldwell family, amounted to the same thing. There was a moment, standing in that courthouse hallway in her too tight dress with Douglas's hands sweating in hers and her father 3 feet away looking like he'd been forced to attend his own execution, when Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not regret, she was too young and too far into the situation to feel regret, but a kind of sober recognition that this was it. This was the hinge point. Everything before this was prologue, and everything after would be the book itself, and she had no idea what the chapters would contain. She looked at Douglas, at his profile, at the way his jaw tightened when the judge said the word lawfully, and she thought, I am trusting you with my entire life. I need you to know that. I need you to understand what I'm giving up for this. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. He was 27 years old and in love with a teenager and convinced that love was enough, and in some ways, he was right, and in the ways that mattered most to Eleanor at 18, he was catastrophically wrong. But that is the nature of marrying too young. You do not yet know who you are, so you cannot know what you need, and so you cannot know what you are giving up. You are giving up a version of yourself you have not yet met. That self, the one who might have traveled, or gone to graduate school, or pursued the career in event planning she had dreamed about before Douglas, before Ryan, before the word pregnancy entered her vocabulary. She existed only as a ghost, an absence, a door that had closed before Eleanor even walked up to it. Eleanor thought about that ghost sometimes. In the years that followed, she thought about her mother's warning, delivered in the hospice bed 6 months before she died. Don't let a man make you small, Ellie. Your father made me small and I let him because I loved him and I thought love meant shrinking. Don't make my mistake. Her mother's mistake. Patricia Caldwell, who had been Patricia Monroe, valedictorian of her class at Washington University, who had wanted to be a surgeon and instead became a housewife in a suburb of St. Louis because her husband didn't believe women needed careers, who had died at 46 with a whole novel inside her that she had never written, with a whole self she had never gotten to be, with a quiet, pervasive sadness that Eleanor had mistaken, as a child, for simple tiredness. Eleanor had promised herself she would not become her mother. And she had succeeded. In the way that mattered most, she had kept her career, her identity, her sense of self. But there were areas, intimate areas, private areas, where she had done exactly what her mother had done. She had shrunk. She had made herself fit into the space her husband could provide, and when that space was too small for her full self, she had not complained. She had simply folded herself smaller. Part 2. The Years of Silence. The first several years of marriage, if viewed from the outside, looked entirely normal. Eleanor finished her associate's degree in business administration through night classes, eventually landing a job as an office manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in St. Louis, Missouri, where they had relocated after Douglas received a promotion. Ryan grew from a colloquial infant into a bright, active boy with his father's easy smile and his mother's stubborn streak. Douglas was, by every external measure, an excellent husband. He mowed the lawn. He coached Ryan's little league team. He remembered anniversaries and brought home flowers and told Eleanor she was beautiful even on the mornings when she felt like a human disaster area, still in yesterday's sweats with baby spit up on her collar. But inside the bedroom, or rather, in the specific geography of their intimacy, something had been wrong from the beginning, and Eleanor, with no frame of reference, could not name it. She did not know what good sex felt like. She had no basis for comparison. Her body, which had awakened slowly after the birth of her son, began to develop a vocabulary of its own, a hunger, a restlessness, that she did not have the language to express. She started to notice that Douglas, every single time they were together, lasted perhaps 2 minutes. 2.5 at the outside. He would push, and then the rhythm would stutter, and then it was over, and then he would roll away and say something tender, like "I love you, baby," or "that was great," and she would lie there in the dark with the ceiling fan turning above her and feel a hollow, aching nothing. She did not know what to call it. She called herself a cold wife in her own private internal narrative. She wondered if something was medically wrong with her. She considered, once or twice, making an appointment with her gynecologist and asking, in the clinical language of a medical intake form, whether it was normal to feel nothing. But how would she even phrase it? "Doctor, my husband and I have sex and I feel like I'm sitting in a waiting room?" The shame was too enormous. She swallowed it and said nothing. There were nights, she never told anyone this, not even her closest friend, Barbara, who lived 2 doors down and with whom she shared the kind of friendship that exists in suburban America, the kind built on school pickups and wine nights and the exchange of recipes. When Eleanor would lie in the bathtub after Ryan was asleep and press her hand against her own body and try to understand what was missing, she would feel something stir, something that wanted to be awakened, and she would bring herself to a certain point and then stop, terrified of what it would mean to go further. As if allowing herself to know her own body fully would be a betrayal of her husband. As if satisfying herself in his absence was a kind of infidelity. This is what no one tells you about sexual dysfunction in marriage, Eleanor thought, years later, lying in that same bathtub in that same house, with a different man sleeping in the bedroom down the hall. No one tells you that it doesn't just affect the person with the dysfunction. It colonizes both people. It turns the sexually satisfied spouse into a person who cannot fully inhabit their own body, who has been so thoroughly conditioned to the shape of their own dissatisfaction that satisfaction itself begins to feel like trespass. Douglas, for his part, seemed content. He initiated often, sometimes every night, and always finished. Eleanor, who had read enough to know that some men were quick but that quick did not necessarily mean unsatisfying for the woman, began to wonder if she was simply broken. She loved her husband. She was attracted to him. She wanted to want him. But the wanting, whatever it was, never arrived. By the time Ryan was 5, Eleanor had developed an elaborate psychological architecture for managing her frustration. She reframed it constantly. Maybe sex wasn't that important. Maybe she was above it, beyond it, a woman whose fulfillment came from her son and her career and her home. She took up jogging. She started reading voraciously, biographies, self-help, the occasional novel that she hid inside a cookbook so Ryan wouldn't ask questions. She cleaned the house with a fury that her neighbor, Barbara, once joked was enough to strip the varnish off the hardwood. She read a book one winter when Douglas was working late 3 nights a week and Ryan was at a sleepover, called The Female Sexual Response, a comprehensive guide for women in long-term relationships. She read it in the bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet lid, as if the location would contain the shame. The book described in clinical detail the phases of female sexual arousal: desire, plateau, orgasm, resolution, and Eleanor read each description with the grim focus of a person studying a foreign language they had never been taught. When she finished, she closed the book and looked at herself in the mirror and thought, I have never, in my entire married life, experienced the plateau phase. I go from nothing straight to nothing. The realization should have been empowering. Knowledge is power, as the saying goes. But knowledge, in this case, felt like holding a diagnosis for a disease no one would acknowledge you had. She knew now. But knowing changed nothing. She thought about her mother's ghost. About the way Patricia had described her own marriage, in one of the few unguarded moments she ever shared with Eleanor. It's fine, Ellie. It's a fine marriage. Your father is a good man. I have a roof over my head and food on the table and a son who loves me. Some women get less. Some women get less. That was the bar. That was the standard by which Patricia and Roe Caldwell had measured her own marriage, and it was the same bar Eleanor found herself unconsciously applying to her own. Douglas was a good man. He provided. He loved her. He was faithful. Some women get less. But some women get more too, Eleanor thought, and immediately felt guilty for thinking it. She confided in Barbara once over a bottle of Pinot Noir on Barbara's back patio while their husbands were inside watching a Cardinals game. They were both slightly drunk, the kind of drunk that lowers your defenses just enough to say things you wouldn't say sober, and Eleanor said something about marriage being complicated in Barbara, who was perceptive in the way that only women who have been married for a long time can be, looked at her and said, "Is it the sex?" Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. What? You heard me. Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it. To laugh it off. To say something about being tired, or stressed, or fine, absolutely fine. Why would you even ask that? But something about the way Barbara was looking at her, not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with the weary recognition of a woman who had been married long enough to know its textures, made her stop. I don't know, Eleanor said, and then, quietly, I don't know what it's supposed to feel like. Barbara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, my first husband had trouble finishing. It was the opposite of your problem. And I spent 2 years thinking it was my fault. And then I finally talked to a therapist, and she helped me understand that it wasn't about me at all. Eleanor looked at her friend. Did it help? My therapy helped more than his dead. I needed to stop making his dysfunction my identity. Eleanor took another sip of wine. She wanted to ask more, but the Cardinals game was ending and the men were coming out onto the patio, and the moment closed like a door. She thought about that conversation for months afterward. She thought about it every time she lay in bed and felt nothing. She thought about it when she caught herself declining sex she couldn't bear another 2 minutes of. And then, when Eleanor was 29 and Ryan was 11 and life had settled into the beige predictability of a Missouri suburb, she met Cameron. Part 3, The Encounter. Cameron Reed was a consultant brought in by Eleanor's company to streamline their logistics software. He was 34, her age exactly, with a kind of face that belonged on a network drama, shark jaw, warm eyes, salt and pepper hair at the temples that he clearly cultivated rather than simply allowed. He was from Seattle originally, recently divorced, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that Eleanor found herself noticing in meetings, in hallways, in the break room where he microwaved salmon for lunch 3 times a week. Their first real conversation happened by the copier. She was wrestling with a document jam. He appeared beside her and said, with a grin, "Those things have a personal vendetta against redheads, I've found." She told him she wasn't a redhead, auburn, she corrected, with the pedantry of a woman who had been teased about her hair color since childhood. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite work laugh. Something about the sound of it lodged in her chest. They did not have an affair immediately. For months, it was nothing. Flirtatious glances, the occasional lunch, conversations about workflow and software integrations that somehow migrated into conversations about childhood memories and divorced parents and what it felt like to be 34 and feel like your life had been written by someone else. Eleanor told Cameron things she had never told anyone, including the fact that she sometimes felt invisible inside her own marriage, present, functional, accounted for, but invisible nonetheless. Cameron, to his credit, never pushed. He was charming, yes, but also patient in a way that felt almost familiar. And then, one evening in November, the company held its annual holiday party at a hotel ballroom in downtown St. Louis, and Eleanor, who had not drunk more than 2 glasses of wine in years, found herself at the open bar making questionable decisions while Douglas was home with Ryan, who had come down with a stomach bug. Cameron was there. He walked her to a cab. She invited him up to the apartment for coffee because she was lonely and flushed and tired of being tired, and because the part of her brain that controlled impulse control had been marinating in champagne for 3 hours. What happened next was not planned. It was not premeditated. It was the most shattering 4 hours of Eleanor's adult life. Cameron was, there is no diplomatic way to say this, a different species of man. He took his time. He asked her what she wanted. He touched her like her body was a map he was genuinely interested in reading. He whispered things in her ear that made her gasp and grip the bedsheets and feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she was not a wife and a mother and a manager and a daughter and a human doing a life, but simply a woman, being wanted, in the most primal and fundamental way. When it was over, she lay on her back with her heart hammering and her breath coming in ragged pulse and thought, so this is what it's supposed to feel like. Cameron stayed until 2 in the morning. They did not talk much. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. He kissed her forehead and left. She locked the door behind him and leaned against it in the dark hallway and cried, not from guilt, not yet, but from the sheer force of what had been awakened inside her. She stood in that hallway for a long time, leaning against the door, listening to the house settle around her. The radiator clanked. It had been clanking for years, and Douglas kept promising to fix it, and never did. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Ryan's bedroom door was closed down the hall. He was asleep, unaware, his whole life still ahead of him in the way that childhood makes all lives seem, as pure potential, unwarped by the compromises of adulthood. Eleanor pressed her palms flat against the door and felt the grain of the wood under her fingers and tried to breathe. She had done something unforgivable. She knew this. It sat in her chest like a hot coal. This knowledge, she had betrayed her husband, her marriage, her own promises. She had done the thing her mother had warned her about, the thing she had sworn she would never do, the thing that broke families and shattered children and turned good women into cautionary tales. She had cheated. And yet her body was still humming. Her skin still felt the ghost of Cameron's hands. Her pulse, which had finally begun to slow, was still faster than it should have been, still carrying the echo of something she had never experienced before, the full, complete, overwhelming sensation of being sexually satisfied by another person. Not tolerating sex. not performing sex, not lying there counting the minutes until it was over, actually experiencing it, feeling it, as something that was genuinely, earth-shatteringly pleasurable. She went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked the same. She had expected to look different, to see some visible mark of what she had done, some alteration in her face that would broadcast her transgression to the world. But she looked exactly the same. The same auburn hair, slightly disheveled. The same freckles across her nose. The same eyes that Douglas had once called his favorite thing about her and that she had always thought were too close together and too ordinary to be anyone's favorite thing. She brushed her teeth. She took off her makeup, carefully, methodically, the way she always did. She put on her pajamas, the old flannel ones with the faded print that Douglas said made her look like a librarian in the best possible way. She got into bed. She lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. At some point, around 4 in the morning, Douglas's arm reached across the bed and found her waist and pulled her gently toward him. He was asleep, or half asleep, doing the unconscious affectionate thing he sometimes did in the middle of the night. She let him pull her close. She felt his breath on the back of her neck, slow and even, trusting, faithful, completely unaware that his wife had just done the worst thing a wife can do. And she thought, I am going to hell. And then she thought, but at least I know now. At least now I know what I've been missing. Within a week, the guilt arrived with a fury. It came for her in the shower, in the car, in the middle of a conversation with Douglas about what to have for dinner. She would be standing at the kitchen counter slicing tomatoes and the memory of Cameron's hands would surface unbidden and she would feel sick with herself, sick with the betrayal, sick with the pleasure, sick with the realization that she had now experienced something in bed that her husband had been unable to give her in 16 years of trying. She replayed those 4 hours obsessively in her mind, and in the replaying, she began to see her husband with new and terrible clarity. His technique, such as it was, his speed, his certainty that finishing meant satisfaction, his complete obliviousness to her experience, it all crystallized into something she could finally name. Premature ejaculation. Chronic, unaddressed, untreated premature ejaculation. She had known men could last a long time. Cameron had proven that beyond any doubt, but Cameron's existence as proof was itself a betrayal she could not reconcile. She had not known, before Cameron, that men could be so different. She had thought she was broken. Cameron had shown her that she was not broken. She was simply married to a man whose body could not perform the way her body needed. The realization brought her no peace. It brought her only anguish, because she loved Douglas. That had never been the question, and she could not unsee what she had seen. She also began to understand, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had been complicit in the silence. Not solely responsible. Douglas had his part, and his history, and his shame, but she had chosen, over and over, year after year, not to speak. She had let the silence calcify into something immovable. She had told herself that not saying anything was the same as being at peace, and it was not. It was the same as being frozen. And frozen things, she was learning, do not stay still forever. They crack. They shatter. They break open when you least expect it. Part 4, The Conversation. Eleanor carried the guilt and the knowledge like 2 bags of wet cement strapped to her shoulders. She lost weight. She stopped sleeping. She logged onto her computer late at night and searched, in the blue glow of the screen, terms like premature ejaculation, sexual dysfunction in marriage, husband finishes too fast, how to talk to your husband about sex. The internet, as always, offered a mixture of useful clinical information and absolute garbage. She read articles on the Mayo Clinic website and WebMD and a forum called Love Shaped, were strangers with usernames like Texas Wife 1978 and Moms Having Fun traded confessions about their marriages that made Eleanor's chest hurt with recognition. What she learned in the clinical summaries and the anonymous forum posts and the carefully worded medical literature was this: premature ejaculation was not uncommon. It was, in fact, one of the most common forms of male sexual dysfunction, affecting somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 men at some point in their lives. It was often psychological in origin. It was treatable with behavioral therapy, topical numbing agents, certain antidepressant medications, and in some cases, a surgical procedure called selective dorsal nerve rhizotomy, or what the popular articles referred to as the nerve severance surgery, a controversial and sometimes effective last resort. She read a post on LoveShaped from a woman named Midwest Wife 42 that said, "I spent 20 years thinking I was the problem. 20 years. I thought I was defective, broken, not a real woman. And then I finally told my husband and he broke down crying and said he'd known since he was a teenager and had been too ashamed to do anything about it." 20 years of parallel shame, ladies. 20 years of two people in the same bed both believing they were failing alone. Get over the shame. Say the thing. Say it out loud. Eleanor read that post 4 times. She read it until the words lost their meaning and then regained it and then lost it again. Then she closed the laptop and went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed her hands over her face and breathed. The next morning, she called her gynecologist and asked for a referral to a therapist who specialized in sexual dysfunction. The receptionist, a cheerful woman with a voice that sounded like it belonged on a cruise ship, asked her what she was looking to address. Eleanor said, "Sexual communication issues in marriage." The receptionist said, "Oh, that's very common. We get that all the time," and gave her the name of Dr. Priya Sharma in Clayton. Eleanor did not make an appointment. Not yet. She needed to talk to Douglas first. She needed to say the thing out loud. Armed with this information, Eleanor sat down across from Douglas at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening while Ryan was at a friend's house, and told him, gently, carefully, with the emotional precision of a surgeon, that she wanted to talk about their sex life. Douglas, to his enduring credit, did not become defensive. He did not shout. He did not deflate. He sat with his hands around a mug of coffee and listened as Eleanor, in a voice that shook only once, explained that she had recently come to understand that their intimacy, or rather, her experience of it, had never been what it could be, and that she believed this was not her fault, and that she wanted to know if he had ever felt the same way. There was a long silence. Douglas looked at the coffee in his mug like it contained the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask his entire life. Then he said, "I've always been this way, Ellie. I thought it was normal. I thought that's how it was for everyone. I didn't know any different." Eleanor said, "What do you mean, you didn't know any different?" And what he told her next broke her heart and rearranged it simultaneously. He told her that his first girlfriend, Jessica, used to mock him for it. Not gently, not with humor, with contempt. She would finish herself off after he was done and say things like, "That's it? That's what you're calling sex?" She left him for another man when he was 22, and the humiliation of that abandonment, the sense that his body had failed him in the most fundamental way a man could fail, had shaped every intimate relationship he'd had since. He had gone to 2 doctors about it in his 20s and been dismissed both times. One told him to relax. The other prescribed him a cream that made everything numb and defeated the purpose entirely. When he met Eleanor, he had been so in love with her, and so terrified of losing her, that he had simply decided to never fully address it. He initiated often because he wanted her, desperately, and because he thought that frequency would compensate for duration. He told himself that she was satisfied because she never complained. He believed it because the alternative, believing that he had been failing her silently for 16 years, was too unbearable to contemplate. Eleanor listened to all of this and felt something inside her crack open, not with anger but with a kind of unbearable compassion. Her husband was not a selfish man. He was a wounded one. He had been carrying the same shame she had been carrying, the same silence, the same fear of being inadequate, and they had spent 16 years in parallel solitudes, each believing they were alone in their failure. "I don't want to lose you, Ellie," Douglas said, and his voice cracked on her name in a way it had not done since their wedding day. "I will do anything. I will see anyone. I will try anything. Just please don't leave me." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand and said, "I'm not going anywhere. But I need you to hear me when I tell you what I've been feeling, and I need you to believe me, and I need us to do something about it." Douglas nodded. He was crying openly for the first time since his mother's funeral. Eleanor had never seen him cry like that. It terrified her and moved her in equal measure. She thought, in that moment, about her mother's ghost again, about Patricia's warning, about the way silence had hollowed out her mother's life from the inside, year by year, until there was nothing left but a kind of polite emptiness. Eleanor looked at her husband across that kitchen table, at his red-rimmed eyes and his trembling hands and the raw, unguarded devastation on his face, and she made a silent promise to both of them: "I will not let us become them. I will not let this silence win." She told him, then, about the affair. Not the full details, not the hotel room, not Cameron's name, not the 4 hours in November, but enough. She told him that she had been with someone else once, and that it had happened because she had been so desperately lonely in their marriage that she had reached for warmth wherever she could find it. She told him it was over. She told him it had meant something. It would be its own betrayal to say otherwise, but that it was a chapter closed, not a door opening. Douglas absorbed this with the stillness of a man absorbing a body blow. His jaw tightened. His eyes went distant. He did not leave the table, but something in him left, some part of him that had been trusting, that had believed their marriage was solid, that had never suspected. "How long ago?" he asked. 6 months. 6 months. He repeated the words like he was testing their weight. "Before I understood what was happening with us. Before I understood what you were dealing with. It happened because I was lost, Douglas. Not because I didn't love you." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if I can forgive that." "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking you to forgive it tonight. I was telling you because I couldn't keep carrying it alone. And because if we're going to fix this, if we're going to actually fix this, you need to know all of it." They sat at that table until midnight. They did not resolve anything that night. But they said the things that had been unsayable, and they cried, and they held each other on the kitchen floor again, that cold, hard floor that had become, over the years, the geography of their most honest moments. And when they finally went to bed, they slept in separate corners of the mattress, as far from each other as the bed would allow, with a silence between them that was not the old silence, not the comfortable, collusive silence of two people pretending everything was fine, but a new silence, raw and uncertain, the silence of two people who did not yet know if they would make it to the other side. Part 5. The surgery. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of specialist appointments. Douglas's dermatologist, a calm, middle-aged man named Dr. Achabe who practiced out of a modern clinic in Chesterfield, confirmed the diagnosis: lifelong premature ejaculation, moderate to severe, with a probable psychological compounding factor. He recommended the surgery, a modified version of the selective dorsal nerve root rhizotomy, referred to in the consent documents as a microirotomy of the penile dorsal nerve. In plain English, they would cut a small number of sensory nerves in the penis to reduce sensitivity and extend the time before climax. The success rate, Dr. Achabi told them in his measured, carefully optimistic way, was approximately 60 to 70%. There were risks, decreased sensation overall, which could swing too far in the opposite direction, chronic numbness, the possibility that the procedure would need to be repeated. But the alternative, ongoing behavioral therapy with no guaranteed outcome, or topical treatments that Douglas had already tried and found unsatisfactory, was, in Dr. Achabi's professional opinion, less likely to produce the kind of results they were looking for. Douglas scheduled the surgery for early January. Eleanor took a week off work to care for him. They told Ryan, now 14, that his father was having a minor outpatient procedure and would be home resting for a few days. The surgery itself took just under an hour. Douglas came home that evening with a dressing and a prescription for pain medication and a list of post-operative instructions that included the phrase abstinence from sexual activity for a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. Eleanor had never felt the weight of time quite so acutely. But she said nothing, refilled his ice pack, and tried to be the dutiful wife. She found herself, during those weeks, in a strange emotional state. She was not hopeful, but she was curious. She watched Douglas move around the house in his loose sweatpants, wincing occasionally, and she felt a tenderness toward him complicated by what they were trying to fix. She also thought about her mother. About the way Patricia had endured her own marriage without ever asking for what she needed. About the way Eleanor had always assumed her mother was passive, even cowardly, in that way. But now, sitting with Douglas on the couch during his recovery, watching him wince and take his medication and try to act normal for Ryan's sake, she understood that her mother's silence had not been passivity. It had been protection. Patricia had protected herself from the rejection that would have come if she had asked for more. She had protected her husband from the shame of being told he was lacking. She had chosen a smaller life because the smaller life felt safer than the risk of asking for the larger one. Eleanor did not want to protect herself anymore. She did not want to protect Douglas from the truth. She wanted, more than anything, for them to be able to look at each other, in the most intimate of moments, in the most private of spaces, and be fully, honestly present. The 6 weeks passed. Then 8. They went back to Dr. Achabi for the follow-up appointment, and the doctor gave them the all-clear. The healing looked good, the nerves were responding as expected, and they could resume sexual activity. That night, Eleanor and Douglas lay in their bed, the same bed where she had felt nothing for 16 years, and attempted to consummate the new arrangement. And it was a disaster. Douglas was nervous. His body, so eager and trusting in the past, had become a stranger to him in its own way. He could not maintain an erection. He tried, and she could see the sweat beading on his forehead and the fear in his eyes, and she felt her heart splinter. He eventually managed partial hardness, entered her, and lasted approximately 90 seconds before climaxing with a sound that was not pleasure but pure anguish. When it was over, Eleanor was on her back staring at the ceiling and Douglas was sitting on the edge of the bed with his face in his hand, and the silence between them was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. "I'm sorry," he said, into his hands. "I'm so sorry." "It's not, I can't, Ellie, I can't do this." Eleanor sat up and said, "It's the first time. It's been 2 months. We need to give it time." But she was scared. She was so scared she could taste it, a metallic dread at the back of her throat, because the surgery was supposed to fix this, and if it had not fixed it, if it had made it worse, then she did not know what came next. Douglas did not sleep that night. Eleanor lay beside him and listened to him breathing in the too careful way of a man trying very hard not to cry, and she felt the full monstrous weight of what they were up against. Not just the physical dysfunction, but the psychological destruction it had wrought on both of them over decades. This was not a wiring problem. This was a wound. She thought about Cameron, briefly and with guilt. Cameron had needed no surgery, no medication, no intervention. His body had simply known what to do. And the unfairness of that, the brutal, arbitrary unfairness of sexual competence, made her want to scream. Why should some men be given this and others not? Why should Douglas, who was kind and faithful and had never wanted to hurt anyone, be penalized for a body that didn't work the way it was supposed to? What cosmic justice was there in that? But then she caught herself, because she knew the answer. There was no justice. There was only what was. And what was a husband who had just failed at the very thing he had gone under the knife to fix, and a wife who was terrified that the next months and years would look exactly like the last 16. A week later, Douglas sat Eleanor down at the kitchen table again, that same kitchen table where their life together had been negotiated so many times, and said the words she had been dreading. Maybe we should get a divorce. Eleanor stared at him. I'm serious, Ellie. I'm serious. I can't keep doing this to you. I've been doing it for 16 years. I've known something was wrong, and I didn't do enough, and now the surgery has made it worse, and I can't keep you in a marriage where you feel like you're missing something for the rest of your life. You deserve more. You've always deserved more. Eleanor began to cry, not the polite, contained tears of a woman managing a difficult situation, but the ugly, heaving sobs of a woman whose entire body was rejecting an idea. I don't want a divorce. I have never wanted a divorce. I didn't marry you for the sex, Douglas. I've never even known what good sex feels like until... She stopped. She almost said Cameron's name. She did not say Cameron's name, but it hung in the air between them like a third person in the room. Until what? Douglas asked, very quietly. Until recently, Eleanor said, which was not a lie and was not the truth and was the worst kind of sentence she had ever constructed in her life. Douglas looked at her. She could see him doing the math she had already done, the months of her distance, her new restlessness, the way she had begun to request things in bed she had never requested before, the way she had started to touch herself in his presence as if practicing a vocabulary she had recently learned. He did not ask the follow-up question. He did not say Cameron's name. He simply looked at her with a sorrow so profound that Eleanor thought it might actually kill them both. Is there someone else? He asked. Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second, a hesitation that was, in itself, a confession. There was, she said. Once. A few months ago. It's over. It meant nothing. No, that's not true. It meant something. But it's over, Douglas. It's been over. Douglas was quiet for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of something that had been heated and cooled too many times and had lost its original shape. I deserve that, he said. After what I put you through, I deserve that. No one deserves that, Eleanor said. You didn't choose to be this way. I didn't choose it, Douglas said. But I didn't fix it either. For 16 years, Ellie. I didn't fix it. They sat at that table until 3 in the morning, and they did not solve anything, but they said everything. They said every terrible, true, terrifying thing they had been holding inside themselves for 16 years. They cried until the tears ran out. They held each other on the kitchen floor, which was cold and hard and exactly the right kind of uncomfortable, and they stayed there until the first gray light of dawn came through the window above the sink. Part 6. The Recovery. For a while, things were worse. The surgery had disrupted whatever fragile equilibrium they had maintained, and the revelation of Eleanor's infidelity, even a single, months-old instance, had introduced a new wound on top of the existing ones. Douglas became quiet in a way Eleanor had never seen. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, put in the required hours of parenting Ryan, and retreated to the garage where he had set up a small woodworking bench. He started making furniture. End tables, bookshelf brackets, a dollhouse for Ryan's younger cousin. He sanded and glued and measured with the obsessive focus of a man trying to build something solid in a life that had come apart at the seams. Eleanor did not push. She gave him space. She also did not stop loving him. She had not known, until that night on the kitchen floor, how much she genuinely did not want to lose him. She had always assumed that love and desire were the same thing, or at least that they moved in the same direction. She had discovered through Cameron that they did not. She could be sexually dissatisfied and still so deeply, structurally in love with her husband that the thought of his absence made her physically ill. She began to see their marriage not as a prison but as a house, a structure they had built together, badly in some rooms, beautifully in others, with water damage in the basement and a gorgeous garden out back. And the question was not whether to burn it down but whether to learn how to renovate. She started seeing a therapist on her own. A woman named Dr. Priya Sharma, who had a practice in Clayton and a particular specialization in sexual dysfunction and marital repair. Dr. Sharma was 50-ish, warm without being sentimental, and she said things like shame is the enemy of intimacy, Eleanor, and had listened marriages like yours like black mold, and you didn't have an affair because your marriage failed. You had an affair because you were lonely in a specific and devastating way that your marriage had failed to address. Eleanor took these ideas home like seeds and planted them in her mind and waited to see if anything would grow. She also began to understand, in her sessions with Dr. Sharma, that the Cameron affair had been about more than just sexual frustration. It had been about agency. For 16 years, Eleanor had been a passenger in her own marriage, going along with the shape of things, accepting the terms, not rocking the boat because rocking the boat felt too dangerous. Cameron had been the first time she had exercised genuine choice over her own body and her own desire. And yes, she had made the wrong choice, the destructive choice, the selfish choice, the choice that had hurt her husband. But it had been her choice. And the wanting of that choice, the needing of it, was itself something that had been starving inside her for years. You can't unmake the choice, Dr. Sharma said during their third session. But you can understand what drove you to make it. And once you understand that, you can start making different choices. Not perfect choices. Not choices without consequence. But different ones. Eleanor thought about that for a long time. Different choices. She had made a catastrophically wrong choice with Cameron. But she was still here. She and Douglas were still here. And the question was not whether to erase the past, but whether to build something on top of it. Douglas, after a month of this cold, careful distance, came to her one evening in the living room and said he wanted to try couples therapy. Eleanor said she had already been thinking the same thing. They found a therapist together. Dr. Sharma recommended a male colleague named Dr. Callahan who worked out of the same building, a gruff Irishman with kind eyes who specialized in what he called sexual repair and long-term partnerships. What followed was 6 months of the most grueling, heartbreaking, occasionally absurd work either of them had ever done. They sat in Dr. Callahan's office, a room with a window that looked out onto a genuinely beautiful maple tree, and talked about sex, which turned out to be a word neither of them had ever been comfortable saying aloud. They talked about the Cameron incident, which Douglas handled with more grace than Eleanor could have imagined, acknowledging that his own failures had created the conditions for her betrayal. They talked about what they actually wanted, not in the abstract, not in the therapy-approved language of I statements, but in the raw, embarrassing, human truth of it. Eleanor wanted to feel desired. Douglas wanted to feel like a man. They had both been so busy protecting themselves from these vulnerable truths that they had never simply said them out loud. In one session, Dr. Callahan asked them to describe, in concrete detail, their ideal sexual experience. Not a fantasy, something real, specific, achievable. Eleanor flushed crimson and said she didn't know. Dr. Callahan said, "You've had it. With someone else. Describe what that felt like." Eleanor's face went from crimson to white. She said, "How do you know about that?" Dr. Callahan said, "Because you've just described it in your body language, Eleanor. And because your husband mentioned it last week. This is a room for honesty. If you can't be honest here, you can't be honest anywhere." So Eleanor described Cameron. Not the full encounter, she spared Douglas the specific details, which felt like a kindness rather than a deception, but the general texture of it. The pace. The attention. The way it felt to have someone genuinely focused on her pleasure, not as a courtesy but as a genuine priority. Douglas sat beside her and listened and did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know that was what you needed. I didn't know that was what it looked like. No one ever told me." Eleanor reached for his hand. He let her take it. "I'm telling you now," she said. Slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild. Douglas went back on a mild anti-anxiety medication at Dr. Callahan's recommendation, not for the sexual effects, but to take the edge off the performance anxiety that was now deeply conditioned into his body. They started over, sensually speaking, no intercourse for the first month, just kissing and touching and learning each other's bodies without the pressure of climax. Eleanor discovered that she liked having her neck kissed in a specific way. Douglas discovered that he could make her gasp by tracing the line of her hip with his thumb. They were, in the language of therapy, resensitizing. And then one night, about 8 months after the kitchen table crisis, something changed. They were in bed, their own bed, the bed where so many failures had accumulated, and Douglas touched her the way Cameron had touched her, with that same slow, deliberate attention, and Eleanor looked up at her husband and thought, oh, this is real." He lasted 20 minutes. Not because of the surgery, necessarily. Dr. Achabe had never given them a definitive answer about whether it had worked or whether the improvement was attributable to the therapy, the medication, the new communication patterns, or simply time and trust. But 20 minutes was 20 minutes, and Eleanor climaxed, not once but twice, and when it was over and she was lying in the tangle of sheets catching her breath, Douglas was staring at the ceiling with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who had been given something he had stopped believing he could ever have. Did that happen?" he asked. "That happened," Eleanor said. He started to cry. She held him. They did not speak for a long time. After that night, their sex life, while not resembling a pornographic film by any stretch of the imagination, began to improve in ways both large and small. Douglas learned to last. More importantly, he learned to pay attention to Eleanor's breathing, to the tension in her thighs, to the sound she made when she was genuinely close versus the sound she made out of marital obligation. He learned to slow down when she needed him to slow down, to speed up when she signaled, to stay with her in the experience rather than racing ahead to his own finish. Eleanor, for her part, learned to ask for what she wanted without shame. She bought books, actual physical books with covers, and left them on the nightstand where Douglas would see them. She introduced him to techniques she had read about. She stopped pretending. She stopped faking. She started genuinely participating, and the more she participated, the more Douglas rose to meet her, and the more they rose to meet each other, the more the entire architecture of their relationship began to shift. There was a moment, a few months after that breakthrough night, when Eleanor was brushing her teeth before bed and caught her own reflection in the mirror and felt something she had not felt in years, possibly decades. She felt like herself. Not a wife. Not a mother. Not a manager. Not a daughter. Not a patient or a project or a role. Just a woman standing in her own bathroom, in her own house, with her own life, feeling something that resembled peace. She did not trust it immediately. Peace, like happiness, had always felt conditional to Eleanor, something you earned, something you performed your way into, something that existed only in the spaces between crises. But this felt different. This felt structural. This felt like the foundation of something rather than the top layer. She spat into the sink and rinsed her toothbrush and went to bed and put her head on her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her without waking up fully, the way he had done for years, and she lay there in the dark listening to his heartbeat and thought, we might actually make it. Part 7, The Complicated Middle. For approximately 3 years after that breakthrough night, Eleanor and Douglas existed in a state of something that felt, from the outside, like happiness. Their careers continued to progress. Ryan went off to college at the University of Missouri on a partial baseball scholarship. He had his father's athletic build and his mother's competitive streak. Eleanor received a promotion to regional director at her firm. Douglas took a job as a senior logistics analyst, working from home 3 days a week, which meant he was present in a way he had never been during Ryan's childhood. They started taking vacations again, real ones, not the 2-day driving trips to Branson they'd done when Ryan was young, but actual flights to places with beaches and ocean views where they slept late and ordered room service and had sex in the middle of the afternoon with a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. The sex was good. Not perfect. Eleanor had read enough to know that perfect was a fiction, a product of pharmaceutical advertising and carefully curated social media, but genuinely, materially better than it had been for the first 16 years of their marriage. Douglas was attentive. He initiated in ways that felt romantic rather than perfunctory. He asked her what she wanted and then did it, consistently, reliably, with a willingness to experiment that Eleanor would not have believed possible from the man who had once treated her body like a closed book. And yet Eleanor sometimes still thought about Cameron. Not with longing, exactly, not with the desperate, guilt-soaked obsession of those first weeks, but with a kind of quiet, residual curiosity. Who was he now? Where was he? Had his life sorted itself out? Did he ever think about that night in November? She did not look for him. She would not have known how to find him without accessing the old company directories, and she had no intention of doing that. But she thought about him the way you think about a beautiful stranger you sat next to on a train once, someone who changed the trajectory of your journey without ever knowing it. And something else happened, too, something Eleanor had not anticipated and could not have predicted. After those 3 years of genuine improvement and mutual effort, she began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to lose interest again. Not because Douglas had regressed. He had not. If anything, he had become more attuned, more generous, more experimental. He was, by every objective measure, exactly the husband she had spent 20 years wishing he could be. But Eleanor's desire, which had been awakened so violently by Cameron and then rekindled so painstakingly by therapy and hard work, began to ebb for reasons she could not identify. It was not that she found Douglas unattractive. It was not that she did not love him. It was something more diffuse, a kind of saturation, perhaps, or the creeping awareness that desire, like energy, could not be sustained indefinitely at peak intensity. She had been running on the adrenaline of crisis and renovation for years, and now that the renovation was complete, the adrenaline was fading, and what was left was the quiet, textured surface of a long marriage, which was, she was discovering, both beautiful and not quite enough. She started declining his advances. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, she simply became evasive in the way that a woman can be evasive when she does not fully understand her own motivations. She cited tiredness. She cited headaches. She set her alarm for early morning so she could be in the shower before he woke up. She developed a sudden passion for evening yoga classes that conveniently overlapped with the window of time when, in the old days, they might have been physically intimate. Douglas noticed. Of course he noticed. But unlike the early years, when he had been oblivious to her dissatisfaction, he now had the emotional vocabulary and the relationship skills to address it directly. He asked her, in the kindest possible tone, whether something had changed. She told him she didn't know. He told her he didn't want to push. She told him she appreciated that. And then she went to bed and lay on her side facing away from him and felt a particular species of guilt that was becoming familiar, the guilt of being the one who had demanded change, and then, when change arrived, retreating from it. "You're doing that thing again," Douglas said one night, after she had declined him for the third consecutive week. She was lying on her back reading a novel. He was on his side facing her. His voice was light, but she could hear the hurt underneath it. "What thing?" "The thing where you say no and then pretend you didn't say no by making it about something else." Eleanor set the book down. "I'm not pretending anything. I just don't. I'm not in the mood tonight." "Okay," Douglas said. "But can I say something without it starting a fight?" She nodded. "I've spent 20 years trying to be what you need, Ellie. And I know I'm not always going to get it right. But if there's something I can do, something I can change, I need you to tell me. Because I've been here before. In the early years. And I know what it looks like when you're pulling away from me." Eleanor felt the words land in her chest like a stone. She thought about lying. She was very good at lying. But she looked at her husband's face, that face she had known for half her life, and she could not do it. "I'm not pulling away because you're doing something wrong," she said. "I think I'm pulling away because I've been running on some kind of emotional fuse for 20 years, and I think I need to stop running." Douglas was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean? Practically?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I think I need you to be patient with me while I figure it out." He nodded. He reached over and took her hand. "I can do that," he said. And he did. For weeks, he did not initiate once. He let her come to him, and when she didn't, he said nothing. He cooked dinner. He took long walks with her in the evenings. He held her hand on the couch while they watched television. He treated her with a tenderness that was not passive-aggressive, not weaponized, not transactional, just kind. Just patient. Just the way a man loves a woman when he has finally, after decades of practice, learned how to love without demanding return. She was grateful. She was also terrified. Because the pulling away had continued even through his patience, even through his kindness, and she did not understand why. She had wanted him to try. She had wanted him to be better. He was better. And yet the wanting in her, the thing that Cameron had awakened, the thing that therapy had rebuilt, was quieter now. Not gone. Just quiet. Like a radio signal that had faded to the edge of its range. She went back to Dr. Sharma for a session. Just one, on a Tuesday afternoon when she had a gap in her schedule and an uneasiness she could not name. I feel like I'm betraying him again, Eleanor said. But this time it's not about someone else. It's about me. I'm the one who wanted us to fix this. I'm the one who pushed for the surgery, the therapy, the conversations. And now that we've fixed it, I feel less. Not more. Less. Dr. Sharma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Eleanor, when you were in the worst part of your marriage, the silent years, the years of feeling nothing, what did you want? I wanted to feel something, Eleanor said. And when Cameron came along, you felt something. Explosively. Violently. The kind of feeling that rearranges your molecules. Yes. And then you worked on your marriage, and you felt something again, differently, more quietly, but genuinely. And now that too has become familiar, and familiar things lose their intensity. This is not a failure, Eleanor. This is the nature of desire. It is not a steady flame. It is a series of ignitions and cooldowns. The question is not whether you are currently on fire. The question is whether the relationship, as a whole, provides enough warmth to sustain you through the cooldowns. Eleanor sat with that. Am I being greedy? Wanting more than warmth? You're being human, Dr. Sharma said. The question is whether the greedy version of you, the version that wants constant ignition, is the truest version, or whether the version of you that can sit with warmth and find it sufficient is closer to who you actually are. Eleanor did not have an answer. She left Dr. Sharma's office and drove to a parking lot and sat in her car for 20 minutes, listening to the engine tick. She thought about Cameron and the heat of those 4 hours. She thought about the kitchen table and the crying and the work. She thought about the quiet warmth of their life now, the vacations, the hand-holding, the comfortable silences, the shared jokes that had accumulated over decades. She thought about the word enough. It was such a small word. 4 letters. And yet it contained multitudes. It contained everything she had been too afraid to ask for at 18, everything she had gone looking for in someone else's bed at 34, and everything she was being asked now to sit with and evaluate honestly. She drove home. She made dinner. She and Douglas ate at the kitchen table, that kitchen table, and talked about Ryan and the water heater and ordinary things. And when Douglas reached across the table and put his hand over hers, she did not feel the explosion she had felt with Cameron. She felt something else. Something quieter. Something that took a long time to recognize because it had no name in her emotional vocabulary, because no one had ever taught her that this was a valid feeling, that this was a legitimate form of love. It felt like home. Part 8, The Reckoning. One morning in March, Eleanor was now 44, Douglas 53. She woke up at 4:30 in the morning for no reason at all and lay in the dark listening to her husband breathe and thought, I have been married for 26 years. 26 years. And I have no idea who I am outside of this. The thought was not as devastating as it might have been if it had come to her in her 30s. At 44, with a husband who loved her, a son at a good university, a career she was proud of, and a house with a mortgage they could comfortably afford, Eleanor had enough self-awareness to recognize that the thought was not a crisis. It was a Tuesday. It was the 4:30 in the morning when every woman of a certain age lies awake and takes inventory of her life and finds the some wanting in some way she cannot quite articulate. She got up. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table, that same kitchen table, and opened a notebook she had started keeping after Dr. Sharma suggested it. She wrote, I am 44 years old. I had been married since I was 19. I had one affair 8 years ago. My husband had a surgery that may or may not have worked. Our sex life is better than it was, but not as good as I sometimes pretend it is. I do not know if I am happy. I do not know if happy is the right question. She stared at what she had written. It looked, in the blue light of the kitchen, like the most honest thing she had ever written. She thought about Cameron Reed. She thought about the 4 hours in November that had shattered her understanding of her own body. She thought about the guilt that had nearly destroyed her and the therapy that had helped her rebuild. She thought about the night on the kitchen floor when Douglas had suggested divorce and she had sobbed into his chest like a teenager. She thought about the night, years later, when he had finally lasted 20 minutes and she had climaxed and he had wept. She thought about the fact that she had spent the last year declining her husband's advances not because she didn't want him but because wanting anyone, wanting anything, felt like too much effort, too much risk, too much vulnerability. And she thought about Douglas's offer at the kitchen table 6 years ago. If you need to be with someone else, I would rather know than not know. But she remembered that she had, at one point during that terrible conversation, said to him, if you want to see someone else, no. I can't say that. I was going to say it and I can't. But she remembered that she had, at one point during that terrible conversation, said to him, if you need to be with someone else, I would rather know than not know. And he had said, I don't want anyone else. I want you. The version of you that actually wants me. That's all I've ever wanted. And she realized, sitting in the dark kitchen at 4:30 in the morning with her coffee going cold, that this was the thing she had been running from. Not her husband's body, not her own desire, but the sheer, annihilating vulnerability of being truly known by another person. Knowing that someone has seen every broken part of you and chosen to stay anyway. That was what terrified her about Cameron, not the sex, but the exposure. And that was what had terrified her about Douglas's recovery, not that he had changed, but that his change held up a mirror to everything she had been avoiding in herself. She closed the notebook. She went back to bed. She lay down beside her husband, who was still sleeping, and she put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and she felt it beating under her palm, steady, reliable, patient, faithful, present. She did not wake him, but she stayed there, her hand on his chest, until she fell asleep. Part 9. The Answer. The following Saturday, Eleanor came home from her morning run. She had, at some point in the last year, taken up running again, because the body remembers what the mind forgets, and found Douglas in the kitchen making pancakes. Actual pancake, from scratch, with blueberries and everything. What's the occasion? She asked. No occasion, he said. I just felt like making pancakes. They sat down at the kitchen table and ate pancakes and talked about Ryan's upcoming spring break and whether they should come visit him at school, and whether the water heater in the house was making the strange noise that Eleanor had been hearing for the past month. They talked about ordinary things with the easy familiarity of two people who have shared a home for more than 2 decades. And then, in the pause between finishing the pancake and getting up to do the dishes, Eleanor said, Douglas, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think our marriage is happy? Douglas set his fork down. He looked at her with an expression she had learned, over 26 years, to read a serious engagement. I think our marriage is real, he said. I think we've had happiness, and I think we've had misery, and I think we have right now, this morning, blueberry pancake and a clean kitten and a son who we love more than anything in the world. I don't know if that adds up to happy. I think happy is too small a word for what we have. Eleanor nodded. She had not expected a more complete answer than that, and she had not received one. But something in his words landed in the right place, the place where she had been carrying the question for so long that she had forgotten she was carrying it. She thought about the nature of marriage, then, in that pause. Not her marriage specifically, but marriage as an institution, as an act of collective hallucination that we agree to participate in because the alternative, living alone, aging alone, facing mortality without a witness, is somehow more terrifying than the compromises that partnership requires. She did not believe marriage was sacred in any religious sense, but she believed it was sacred in a functional sense. It was the closest thing modern people had to a sacred vow, a daily choice to remain, to stay, to keep showing up even when showing up felt like too much. She believed, too, that she had been given a second chance that many people never received, the chance to understand what had been broken and to fix it, not perfectly, but genuinely, by being present, by being honest, by being willing to grow. "I want to try," she said. "I want to try again. Not because anything is wrong, because I think I've been holding back. And I don't want to hold back anymore." Douglas reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and slightly sticky with pancake syrup. It was the least romantic possible context for a declaration of renewed commitment, and somehow that made it more meaningful than any candle at dinner or beach vacation could have been. "I have never stopped trying," he said. "I'd been right here, Ellie. I'd been right here the whole time." That night, they made love, slowly, without urgency, without the desperate performance of either early arousal passion or late-stage anxiety. It was the kind of sex that middle-aged people do not talk about because it does not sell movies or magazines, but that is, Eleanor thought, the truest kind, unhurried, communicative, present, imperfect, and deeply, quietly pleasurable. Douglas lasted exactly long enough, not because he was counting, but because they were both, for the first time in as long as she could remember, inhabiting the same moment at the same time. When it was over, Eleanor was crying. Not from sadness. Not from relief. From something she did not have a word for, something that lived in the space between grief and gratitude, and a particular, hard-won piece of a woman who has finally stopped running from herself. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she used to say it at 20, without calculation, without defense, without the faintest residual hesitation. Just, "I love you." "I love you too," he said. And then, after a beat, "I'm sorry it took me so long." "You got there," she said. "That's what matters." Part 10. The Quiet Truth. Eleanor Caldwell is 48 years old as I write this. She has been married to Douglas Whitmore for 29 years. Their son Ryan is a junior at the University of Missouri, studying to become a physical therapist, and calls home every Sunday evening without fails. Douglas has been promoted twice more and is now approaching the kind of retirement horizon that once seemed impossibly distant. Eleanor serves on the board of the Regional Women's Shelter and has, in the last several years, become an unexpectedly vocal advocate for couples counseling, not the crisis management kind, but the maintenance kind, that come in once a year and make sure you're still talking to each other kind. Her sex life with Douglas is not what she would have imagined for herself at 18, or at 30, or even at 40. It is better than it was for the first 16 years. It is different from the 4 hours she spent with Cameron Reed in a hotel room in downtown St. Louis 8 years ago. Cameron was fire, sudden, illuminating, consuming, and ultimately unsustainable. Douglas is something else. Douglas is the pilot light. He is always on. He is always warm. You can adjust the thermostat. You can walk away for a while and come back and he is still there, still glowing, still doing the quiet work of keeping the house heated. She does not believe that sexual ability determines the quality of a marriage. She has thought about this extensively, in the way that only a woman who has been to the absolute bottom of a question can think about it, and she has arrived at a position that she understands is unfashionable and will not make her any friends at dinner parties. The sex matters. But it matters differently at different stages of a marriage, and it matters differently to different people. And the idea that sexual incompatibility is an insurmountable obstacle is, in her experience, a lie that we tell ourselves when we are too afraid to do the harder work of communication, therapy, and genuine personal accountability. She also believes this: if Cameron Reed had not come into her life, briefly, catastrophically, in that hotel room in November, she and Douglas might never have had the conversation that cracked them both open and eventually rebuilt them into something more honest and more durable than what they had been before. Cameron was not her salvation. He was her catalyst. He was the external force that did what internal courage could not. He made the status quo unsustainable. Some people come into your life to change you, Eleanor told her therapist during one of their last sessions, and some people come into your life to change the person you're already with. And some people come into your life and change nothing except the door you're standing in front of. Cameron changed the door. Douglas was always the house. She does not see Cameron anymore. She does not look for him. She keeps him in a small, clean corner of her memory, not as a fantasy of what could have been, but as a record of what she was capable of feeling when she allowed herself to feel it. She has no desire to act on those memories. The memories are enough. They are a chapter, not the whole book. She does not advise other women to have affairs. She says this very clearly and very firmly, and without the hedging or the false equivalence that infects so many similar stories. What she did was wrong. It was a betrayal of her marriage, and she has lived with that, and she does not recommend it as a strategy for marital improvement. If you are a woman lying awake at night thinking that someone else can give you what your husband cannot, she says, the answer is not an affair. The answer is a difficult, expensive, emotionally devastating conversation with your husband. And if your husband cannot have that conversation, the answer is a therapist. And if the therapist cannot help, the answer is a different therapist. The answer is never not trying. She and Douglas fought for their marriage the way you fight for a house that is structurally sound but has been badly maintained, with patience, with professional help, with the occasional burst of rage that you then have to apologize for, with a willingness to admit that the blueprints were always good and the problem was in the construction. It took years. It was not glamorous. There is no television drama about two people in their 40s in suburban St. Louis going to couples therapy and learning to communicate better in bed. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it worked. Whether it made them happy, in the end, Eleanor cannot say with certainty. She suspects that happiness is not the point. She suspects that the point is this: two people who wake up in the morning and choose each other again. Not because the sex is perfect. Not because the fights are over. Not because the future is guaranteed. But because the past, all of it, the teenage pregnancy and the surgery and the affair and the kitchen table and the crying and the silence and the blueberry pancakes and the long, strange, difficult, worth it years, the past is enough. It is more than enough. It is the whole damn thing. She would not trade it. Part 11. The letters she never sent. There is a box in the guest room closet that Eleanor has never told Douglas about. It sits on the top shelf, behind a stack of old photo albums and a bag of Ryan's baby clothes that she has never been able to throw away. The box contains letters, not greeting cards, not photographs, not the usual artifacts of a life accumulated over decades. Letters. Specifically, letters that Eleanor wrote and never sent. She started writing them after the night on the kitchen floor, when Douglas suggested divorce, and she realized how close she had come to losing everything. She wrote the first one to Douglas, sitting at that same kitchen table at 3 in the morning while he slept upstairs. It was not a letter she could give him. It was too raw, too unfiltered, too much the pure undiluted truth of what she felt in that moment. I don't want to lose you, it began. I have never wanted to lose you. I have spent 20 years being afraid that you would leave me, and the irony is that I was the one who was always leaving, not physically, but emotionally, by never telling you the truth about what I needed, by letting the silence grow until it became a wall, by being so afraid of your judgment that I chose to suffocate rather than risk it. She wrote that letter, and then she wrote another, and then another. Over the months that followed, she wrote letters to Douglas about things she could not say out loud, her fears, her shame, her memories of Cameron that still surfaced unbidden, the complicated grief she felt for the years they had lost to silence. She wrote letters to her mother, who had been dead for 20 years and who Eleanor had never stopped missing, with a physical ache that linked somewhere behind her sternum. She wrote letters to Cameron Reed, not to send, never to send, but to have a place to put the feelings that had no legitimate outlet. In one letter, she wrote, "You didn't save me. You didn't destroy me. You showed me something I didn't know existed. I am not grateful for what you did. It was wrong, and I was wrong, but I am not sorry either. I am a woman who learned, in one night, that she was capable of feeling more than she had ever allowed herself to feel. And that learning cost me my marriage, and then it saved my marriage." She never sent that letter. She never sent any of them. They sat in the box in the guest room closet, accumulating, becoming a private archive of everything she could not say and everything she needed to understand. She told Dr. Sharma about the letters once, in their 4th or 5th session. "It started as a therapeutic exercise," Eleanor said. "You know, journaling, processing, all the things you're supposed to do. But then it became something else. It became a way of being honest without consequences. I could say anything in those letters. No one was going to read them. No one was going to judge me. I could just say the true thing." Dr. Sharma had nodded slowly. "Letters you never send are like conversations with ghosts. They let you say what needs to be said without requiring the other person to be present. They're a form of private truth-telling." Eleanor had thought about that for a long time. She still didn't have a definitive answer. The letters accumulated over the following years. Some were addressed to people who would never read them: her mother, Cameron, the 18-year-old girl she had been. Some were addressed to Douglas, full of things she eventually found the courage to say out loud, and some full of things she suspected she never would say, because some truths are better kept as private knowledge than spoken aloud. She had never shown the box to Douglas. It was her secret, alongside the affair and the years of silence. The box was proof that she had been doing the work, the solitary, unglamorous work of understanding herself, of building a self that could exist outside of wife and mother and manager, a self with a voice that could put things on paper even when it couldn't speak them aloud. She was not sure whether the letters were healthy or avoidance, but she kept writing them anyway. One evening, in the 6th year after the kitchen table crisis, Eleanor came home from a women's shelter board meeting feeling raw and tired. Ryan had called to say he was thinking about dropping his physical therapy program to pursue music production, and Eleanor had tried to be supportive while internally catastrophizing. Douglas was in the garage, working on a jewelry box, and the house was quiet. She went to the guest room. She opened the closet. She took down the box. She sat on the guest bed and opened the box and began to read. She read letters from 5 years ago, when the future was uncertain and the surgery had failed. She read letters from the renovation years, when she was still afraid. She read letters from the quiet years, the good years. She read the letter to Cameron. She read the letter to her mother. She read the letter to the 18-year-old girl she had been, which said, in part, "You think love is enough. And you're right that love is necessary, but you're wrong that it's sufficient. Love is the foundation, But it's not the house. You still have to build the house. You still have to learn to speak. The silence is never safer. It will destroy you if you let it. Eleanor closed the letters. She sat on the guest bed with tears running down her face, feeling something too large to contain in any single emotion. She was feeling the weight of the years, the strange, improbable grace of a marriage that had cracked and been rebuilt and was still standing. She put the letters back in the box. She put the box back on the shelf. She went downstairs and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window watching the sun go down over the backyard, where Douglas had built a garden shed and where the tomatoes were finally turning red. She thought about the question Douglas had answered on the Saturday morning of the pancakes. Do you think our marriage is happy? She had been dissatisfied with his answer. But sitting here now, 5 years later, she thought she finally understood what he had been trying to say. Happiness was not the metric. The question was not whether they were happy. The question was whether they were real. Whether they had built something that could withstand the weather. Whether they had chosen each other so many times that the choosing had become a reflex. She was real. He was real. Their marriage was real. That was enough. That was more than enough. She heard Douglas come in from the garage, wiping sawdust off his hands. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "The tomatoes are coming in. Did you see?" And she said, "Yes, I saw." And he said, "I was thinking we should make salsa this weekend. The big batch, like we did 2 years ago." And she said, "That sounds perfect." And it was. It was perfect. Not because it was exceptional, not because it was romantic, not because it was the kind of moment that would make it into a highlight reel, but because it was ordinary. Because ordinary things, done with someone you love, in a life you have built together through crisis and silence and the long, slow, worth it work of learning to stay, ordinary things are the point. Ordinary things are the whole damn point. She walked across the kitchen and put her arms around him. She felt his arms come around her, automatically, the way they always did. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he said. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm okay," she said. "I'm just really glad you're here." Then he said, "Salsa this weekend?" "Salsa this weekend," she said. And it was enough. It was so much more than enough.